Okay, thank you everybody for joining us, and we are going to discuss today the MSHA final rule for metal non-metal workplace examinations. We've heard about this rule for quite some time, and in the next week or so it's going to go effective, and later this year we'll begin seeing enforcement in earnest on it. But to welcome you, my name is Nick Scala. I am the chair of the National MSHA Practice Group at Carey, where I represent contractors, independent contractors and mine operators in the full breadth of MSHA matters, whether contests of citations or management of investigations, both age investigations, fatality injuries, or discrimination investigations, as well as assisting in general compliance procedures and policies, which this new rule falls under. So I will be your host for the next hour. Thank you for joining me. And we'll go ahead and get started with an overview of what we'll talk about. So just briefly at the beginning, we'll compare the final rule that will go into effect on June 2nd with the existing rule on metal non-metal workplace exams that's been in effect since the establishment of Part 46 and 47. We will look briefly also at the evolution and mostly how that rule has changed and the laundry list of days that have been noted as effective dates and the delays that have gone with them. We will then take a look at compliance requirements as well as some strategies for compliance at your facilities. So as I said before, if there's any questions, please feel free to use the chat function on the online feature, and I will try to answer those either at a logical point in the discussion or we'll answer them when we get to the end of the presentation. So with that, we'll take a look on what should be a familiar slide, or familiar language at least, but this is the existing rule for 5657-18002, also known as the Workplace Exam Standard. And we've had to comply with this for quite a while. We are well aware of it, and it's also been the basis of comparison for the new rule throughout the rulemaking process. But it's basic in that it has very little requirements other than a competent person must do a workplace exam once per shift, at least. The record keeping, we know we have to keep it for a year, and that doesn't change. But what has to be included on that record is significantly changed in the final rule. Under the existing regulation, all we need to include is the name of the person that did it, the date, and what areas were inspected. That is it. So that is going to be an area where we have more paperwork and more of a burden to complete that paperwork under the existing rule. There's also going to be changes when we look at it to when that exam must be completed. One item that will not change as we move forward is Part C in this, and which identifies or addresses instances in which an imminent danger is observed. And in that situation, we're going to be treated the same, that we just have to remove any person from the area until the danger is abated. And that's going to stay the same. We're not going to talk about that much more, but imminent dangers are still going to be a part of this in the removal or withdrawal of persons. If we're looking at the final rule, or the new rule, however you want to call it, we are seeing some differences, and notably there is a new section, Section D of 18002, as well as several subparts to Part A. The big change, and the one that has got most of the headlines throughout this process, is in yellow on the top section. It says, the working place, a competent person designated by the operator shall examine each working place at least once a shift before work begins or as miners begin work in that place. So this is one area that we have had a bit of a change from what the proposed rule was back in June of 2016. Here we have that it can be before or as miners begin work in that area. And that is a beneficial change to allow operators to kind of have the workplace exam ongoing while miners enter an area. But I think it also is going to pose some issues as we see enforcement roll out. How big of an area are we talking about? What happens if there's a incident in an area or a section of an area that had not been inspected yet because the competent person was in the progress of completing it. These are going to be situations that I think give operators and any company who's performing a workplace exam a good bit of headaches as we go through rollout on enforcement. And that is, something that we're not going to see in earnest for a few more months, but it's nonetheless, there are going to be questions there about how that is implemented. As with any MSHA regulation, there is always a concern about subjective interpretation by MSHA personnel. Is there going to be a consistency issue between individual inspectors, between field offices, between districts? Hopefully, that's not the case. The agency has, consistently described efforts to achieve consistent interpretations or improve consistency on enforcement throughout this process, including sharing their training materials. But nonetheless, it's always something that has to be considered when miners get into, or operators get into this workplace exam scenario. And it's also something that, unfortunately, is going to get clarified, or we're going to get clarity through the contest process and eventual litigation of the issues. So in addition to that, there's, as I said before, significant changes to what we have to include on our record keeping. That record keeping is still going to be required to be maintained for 12 months from the date of creation, but now we're going to have to include information such as a description of the adverse conditions. We're going to have to include information that is the date of the corrective action taken on an adverse condition listed on a workplace exam. Also, somewhat unspoken, but in effect, the existing rule requires that an exam be made once per shift. There's actually no requirement as to when we have to make the record of examination, and that is clarified in the final rule, that the record of the exam must be made before the end of the shift for which the exam was conducted. So, we don't have the ability to fill these out the next day. We have to complete them on the day that it was conducted. And so that also means if we have multiple exams being conducted throughout a shift, those multiple exams need to be reduced to a record as well if they're going to be distinguished as independent workplace exams. The requirement of the rule is at least once per shift. So if we're conducting more, or if we're conducting multiple examinations for multiple areas or different areas of the mine, we are also going to have to reduce all of those records to writing by the end of each shift. Now, we will talk a bit later about what happens if maybe we're a 24/7 operation, or we have shifts backing up to each other, and completing those records and completing that in inspections or examinations. But we'll talk about that a bit more as we get through the presentation. Another area that has changed is not just the maintenance of the rule, but the rule has to be made available to. It was previously just MSHA inspectors. Now they've included authorized representatives of the secretary, which are MSHA inspectors, or representatives of miners. And they have to be provided with a copy of the record upon request as well. So somewhat minor change, but it does increase the number of persons that can request a record of the workplace exam. And it's something to keep in mind. So when we talk about this rule, we have been hearing about it for quite some time. It was put out into a proposed form rather quickly, and it was finalized rather quickly as well at the tail end of the last administration. We had the proposed rule in June 2016, and then the first final rule issued in January of 2017, right as the inauguration of the Trump administration was taking place. Initially, we had an effective date of just about, I guess to the day, a year ago, and that was delayed until October 2017. Then it was delayed again until March 2018, and then until our current effective date, which is June 2nd. So that is when the rule will go into effect. Now, we know that on April 9th, MSHA released their final rule, which included additional responses to comments, as well as giving us the final language for the regulation, which was the same as we had seen from a previous amendment in 2017. But they reinforced that it is going to be effective on June 2nd. But then one change that we're hearing, and this has been broadcast by MSHA in the meetings, is that they aren't going to be really enforcing this rule until October 1st. That's what they've set as their enforcement deadline date. Now, that doesn't mean under any circumstance. They have said that they will enforce a new rule if flagrant violations are observed, and I'm guessing that would be situations where no record is created, or no exam is conducted, or it is being conducted long after the shift has began. So really, situations for the most part that we could also see as being problematic under the existing rule anyways. But you know, for the most part, MSHA has said that inspectors are going to be out. They're going to be trying to assist operators in developing these policies and procedures if we haven't done so already. Also in the evolution of the rule, some might remember that when this was initially proposed, there wasn't the provision that the exam could be completed as miners began work in an area. It was just before. Also, there was a requirement that the competent person sign and date the record. And that provision received quite a lot of pushback immediately out of the gate, and it was withdrawn rather quickly. Another item that changed was in the previous iterations of the rule, there was a requirement that the date of the corrective action be recorded, as well as the corrective action taken and the miner who performed the corrective action. So that has been significantly reduced as well to just the date of the corrective action. And that's something that, you know, we should be in a best practice recording anyways, whether on a workplace exam or a pre-shift examination, because how else are we going to prove that action was taken on something that is listed in those exams or those inspection documents? So, you know, just for pre-shift exams as well, if we are conducting these pre-shift examinations on equipment, for example, I would recommend that we also list that, the date that any defect was corrected or addressed, just so there isn't a concern about a repeat issue and it having not been addressed previously. Also, as part of this final rollout, MSHA has been, through the month of May, conducting some in-person meetings at district offices throughout the country. There is two more of those meetings to take place in May in, I believe, Texas tomorrow, and then as well in Denver. And then on June 6th, MSHA will be holding a video teleconference for the rule again. And in those presentations, they're reviewing a PowerPoint presentation that they have created, and you know, they are been open for questions as well. So if you still are having questions as the rule gets rolled out in June, I would consider maybe logging into one of those teleconferences or reaching out to any other resource, because we are getting into the situation or the time where we have to be prepared for the inspectors to come out and start enforcing in October. So when we're looking at this, though, I also want to point out some areas that are not changing. Now, MSHA has long established that a competent person is that person who is going to have to complete these exams. And the competent person is defined by MSHA, and it is someone who's having the abilities and experience that fully qualify him to perform the duty in which he is assigned. This is designated by mine management. It does not have to be mine management, although MSHA would like it to be. But that is still the same. We still have the ability as the operator, as an independent contractor, as the employer, to designate who is going to be conducting that exam. But as we'll talk about here in a minute, we're going to have to take some steps to make sure that they are fully competent. And that's not new to this rule, but it's kind of the culmination of some guidance that MSHA has put out and enforcement that we've seen over the last few years. Also, this is going to apply to any working place where miners are going to be during that shift. And when we're talking about a working place, there were some questions about where that would encompass for this new rule, given that the exam has to be completed before miners begin the shift. And if we look back in 2015, there was a program policy letter issued by the Metal Nonmetal department on working places and competent persons as they relate to this workplace exam regulation. And it says that a working place is all locations where miners work in the extraction or milling process. This includes areas where work is performed on an infrequent basis, such as areas accessed primarily during maintenance or cleanup. And all these areas must be examined once per shift. So that's not really going to change. What we did receive throughout this rulemaking process is a bit of clarification on what a working place is, and MSHA said that is going to be all those areas that are encompassed in the extraction and milling process. Is also we have the areas that are roads traveled to and from the working place. So if we have a haul road going into the plant or an entry road, that is going to be considered part of the working place. We're going to have to do an exam of that before shift begins or as miners begin that work in that area. It's not going to include, and I repeat, does not include, and MSHA has said this, roads not directly involved in the mining process, admin buildings, parking lots, or inactive storage areas, along with a couple others. Also, if we have isolated or abandoned areas of the mine, we do not have to perform exams for these areas on a daily basis unless miners are going to be working in that area. And if that changes during the course of the shift, then before or as those miners begin working in that area, a workplace exam has to be completed. I would also recommend, and we'll talk about this as maybe a best practice as we roll this out, if we are going to have isolated or inactive areas in the mine, or maybe idle areas on a daily basis that may switch or change, we want to have some delineation of those, whether it's cones or some type of barrier to prevent access, or we want to list what areas may or may not be active on an alternative document or our exam, just so there aren't any questions with what areas were not inspected because of that reason when an inspector comes out. I see there is a quick question that we'll answer, and it's, is a tour through an area considered work? I think that depends on the nature of the tour. Are we just going through in a vehicle and we are not going to be getting out? I would say that depends. It's going to be more dependent on what is happening. Are we getting out and conducting some kind of work? Are we going to be looking at a specific piece of equipment? Who is participating in the tour? But I would say if we are driving through an area, there is a question of whether or not that constitutes work or is involved in the mining process. But if we are moving through an area to get to an alternative area or maybe to get to an area to perform an exam, I would say that would not include it. A walking tour with guests, we've received some clarity. Yes, I would want to do a workplace exam before I walk through an area with guests. Yes, most certainly. I think that would be a prudent decision by the mine operator. Obviously that's going to be, again, dependent on whether or not the plant is operational, but I would recommend doing a workplace exam for hazards that those guests may be walking. Considering, again, what is a working place, again, it's not the entire mine, unless the entire mine is going to be worked in by miners during that shift. If that is the case, then the entirety of that mine needs to be inspected before or as miners begin shifts. And this is one area where I think this rule may be requiring companies to complete a number of different workplace exams if they aren't already. Because if we do have an entire mine working, or a large facility that would require an hour or two or maybe more to complete a workplace exam for all areas, you're going to want to have competent persons in each area designated to perform the exam so that we can not have a delay or not have inefficiencies based on it. So I would recommend that we look at training multiple persons to be competent to perform the workplace exam, and we look at what areas need to be completed at what time. Are we having staggered shifts? How is that going to work? But those are all things that need to become taken into consideration while we're working to comply with this new regulation. Also look at what contractors are going to do. Okay, so if we have performed workplace exams in an area, MSHA has said in these meetings that the contractors do not need to perform their own workplace exam, but the operator would be responsible for notifying that contractor of any adverse conditions that were found during their workplace exam. If conditions did change or could have changed from when that first workplace exam was taken or conducted by the operator until the contractor went into the area, another one should be completed. If you want my opinion, I think that it is a good practice to have a new shift of persons that I would say are the contractor conduct their own workplace exam. I think that is a prudent move. I think that you need to develop a system with each contractor that's on your site and delineate who is responsible for completing the workplace exams in what area, if we're going to have any discussion about who is doing what. But in that situation that MSHA kind of talked about at one of their meetings, that you conduct an exam and then later in that shift work contractors come in, I think I would want that contractor to do their own exam as well. And as a contractor, I think I would also want to do that, because then I'm not relying on what someone else may or may not have found. And also, if MSHA comes out and asks for my workplace exam that day, I'm able to provide a document and not relying on a document created by another company. We do have another question, and that is, would new construction of a mine, machinery, or equipment be considered as part of the extraction and milling process? MSHA does consider construction of a mining activity, and therefore this will apply in those situations. That is considered a mining process if we look at the definitions in the Mine Act. So additionally, we talked about the competent person, and while that is not changing the language around it, we do need to look at what MSHA put out in 2015 as their expectations for a competent person. Now, they list here that a best practice is for a foreman or other supervisor to conduct the exam. That is not required, and they state so much. But they do want experienced personnel, and that includes experience in recognizing hazards or conditions. And you want someone who's both familiar with that area as well as someone who has received training on those topics. So this is, again, something that task training has infiltrated. Are you task trained on identifying hazards or adverse conditions? Are you trained on properly completing the workplace exam form? These are areas that I think we're going to see heightened scrutiny about as we go through this. We've already seen a significant amount of scrutiny on this topic throughout the last few years about whether someone was adequately trained or had the experience needed to be a competent person. Again, it is the operator's right to designate that competent person, but then if it's called into question that person's competency, we need to be able to defend it. And with MSHA, as with anything with MSHA, looking at that training documents, if we had task training on this, that always helps us as an operator, proving that we were diligent into designating our competent persons. So these meetings with MSHA, they have identified that competent persons need to be task trained, and they're going to expect so much. Again, that's not a specific requirement under the definition of a competent person, but I think it is a best practice to ensure that there aren't any questions regarding whether or not someone is competent to hold that title. Also, when we're looking at it, as I said before, I think we're going to be in a situation where multiple persons are going to have to be listed as a competent person or considered as a competent person to perform this exam. They do need to know how to properly complete the paperwork. And also, it doesn't mean that every competent person is going to be competent for each area in a working place. So maybe you have a facility where you have a primary and a secondary plant, and they're separated by a significant distance, and your crews, for the most part, man one plant. That doesn't mean that your secondary plant person is competent to perform the workplace exam in the extraction area, or maybe even not in the primary plant. Again, that's going to be greatly dependent on your individual operation and how much persons move between, and also how you form any training program to develop that competency. But again, I think that it would be wise of operators to be pretty thorough in their consideration of what is going to be determining competency and who is going to be listed under that label. So, this is going to be an area, this regulation has got a lot of attention. We know that the inspectors are aware it's rolling out. I recently worked on a case that had an inspector back in 2016 trying to enforce the proposed rule after it was issued. So, it's widely known. The inspectors are ready for it. When enforcement does begin, I think we should be ready for any and all interpretations of how this is going to play out. And I think determining competency, if we have multiple persons performing that, is going to be an area where we see some pushback or maybe an area of contention with the agency. One question is, do mine operators have to maintain a specific list of competent persons for the purposes of workplace exams? They have to keep a list of competent persons for the purposes of training and doing task training, but not a competent persons list for performing workplace exams. So if we have someone completing that task training, they need to be listed on our training plan, but we do not have to maintain a list of those competent persons. Now, it may not be a bad idea to do so, but there is no requirement that we do. This slide is taken from that MSHA PowerPoint presentation that's being used at these meetings. And I thought it was a good slide to include for you all because it does rather succinctly break down the requirements from the existing standard to the regulations under the final rule. So, this is a good tool that we can continue to use from MSHA, but it specifically tells us if there's been any change or if it's a new requirement, such as under the notification of minors section. So I would, recommend that maybe for the purposes of creating our policies or creating our procedures or even our forms that we may use, that we look at a document such as this to help us see what is required and what isn't. And here we have from the horse's mouth, so to speak, the changes between the existing rule and the new rule. So this could be a helpful document for you, and that is why I included it, and it just briefly summarizes all the changes. But looking more pointedly at the requirements or the changes, I want to talk about several of the big ones. And, again, we'll start with the biggest change, really, or maybe one of, but workplace exams must be completed at least once per shift before or as minors enter a working area or begin working in an area. So, that is a requirement of the final rule. Currently, we understand that it's just once per shift. Now, it has long been an MSHA best practice that the workplace exam start before shift for the metal non-metal industry. but it has not been a requirement until now. So the exam, it should be as close as possible to the start of work, or at least in a proximity of time that we don't expect the conditions to change based on what we inspected previously. So again, this kind of comes into play for when we're talking about, is one person doing the exams and they're starting 2 hours before. If that's the case, that's fine, but we want to make sure that it is maybe a non-dynamic environment. Maybe it's because the plant is not running, but we don't expect the conditions to change greatly in that time frame. One area that has been discussed is the 24/7 operations, or maybe those operations that have consecutive shifts. Now, MSHA has said that operators may conduct a workplace exam for a next shift at the end of the previous shift, as long as it includes all areas where the miners will be working on that shift. And again, it needs to be completed close to that time. So there doesn't have to be a break in shift. Now, one area where MSHA is silent in their guidance on this rule since it's become final, but we've previously heard them give some direction, is can the previous shift perform that workplace exam for the latter shift? And the answer is they can. But again, there has to be that communication if there are adverse conditions discovered that are not promptly corrected. That notification has to be provided to that next shift. So we want to make sure that that is an area that we're keeping in mind. Also, when we're talking about as a miners enter an area, again, I think this is a nice kind of break for the industry because it gives them a little bit of flexibility. But I also think this is an area that gives me some of the most pause. Because again, I think about it, and maybe it's just the doomsday scenario that an attorney runs through your mind, but what happens when a company is in the process of performing a workplace exam while miners are entering an area, or as they are entering an area, and an inspector comes out and observes a condition that the competent person hasn't observed yet. Or God forbid, there's an incident and someone is injured on the opposite side of the area that the competent person is standing at that time performing the exam. I think those are situations where you can probably write the narrative on your own about how the enforcement is going to roll out. But nonetheless, it is an opportunity for the company to do it as miners begin an area, not just before they do so. So that's a big requirement, a big change given the proximity of time or the chronology of when these have to occur. But I think we need to be careful on relying too much on the as miners begin to enter an area. That has to be tailored to the size of the area, maybe what type of activities are taking place in the area. I think probably we wouldn't want to send people into a extraction area with a 50 or 80 or 100-foot high wall before the workplace exam has been done. I think MSHA won't look kindly upon that. Now, if it's a shop and maintenance is taking place, that's a different situation. Or if it's maybe the production area or the processing plant and it's relatively small and it hasn't changed from that greatly from the night before, possibly that's one where we can do it as miners begin working in that area. Again, though, that's going to be a regulation or a requirement that we have to look closely at. What is our working area? What is our working place if we're dividing it up between the entire mine? I don't think this, as miners begin working in the area, is meant to allow for us to have one person do the entire mine and everyone begins work and the competent person is in the extraction area while everyone's working up at half the population of the employees are working at the processing plant. That might be a couple hundred yards away or more. So that is not, in my opinion, what this is meant to allow. It needs to be more tailored and more nuanced. In the next area that we can talk about is the exam records, and specifically I want to talk about the descriptions of adverse conditions. The adverse conditions and providing a description of it are a new requirement, and I think it's one, again, where there's going to be questions about what is the adequacy of a description. Now, MSHA says that the description needs to be sufficient enough to allow mine operators to notify miners of a condition and take prompt corrective action. So that's quite vague. That can be housekeeping issue. That can be, material spillage on a walkway. There is multiple ways where we can phrase something. Obviously for time purposes, maybe we're not going to write a paragraph about it, but I think there needs to be at least some more pointed identification to the exact area. Maybe it is catwalk B has material spillage. That is a way we could phrase a description. We want to be aware that we don't have to require, or we don't have to include a description of an adverse condition if it is promptly abated. MSHA specifically says that promptly abated or promptly means before miners could potentially be exposed. And that is a different definition. So we want to think about, can something be cleaned up or can it be fixed before miners are exposed? If that is not the case, we need to promptly notify them or notify them before they enter the area or are exposed to the hazard. And we need to do something to prevent access to it, whether that is barricading it or preventing access or notification with signage. Now, one area where I think MSHA has somewhat taken a different turn in their meetings in May is they have said a couple of these meetings that you do not need to record a description of the adverse condition on the workplace exam if it is corrected any time during the shift. And that somewhat goes contrary to what we have been anticipating was going to be the enforcement of that provision throughout the rulemaking process, because we are looking at regulation that says unless promptly abated. But now MSHA is saying, if we clean up an area or we fix something during a shift, we no longer need to include it. So that's something that has been, said by some significant higher-ups at MSHA at these meetings. I would be cautious in how we rely on that information, because I don't think the inspectors are all going to see it that way. When MSHA is coming out over the next couple months, as they've said they will, to discuss it, it might be something to bring up with your individual inspectors to see how they're going to look at that, because it says unless promptly abated, and promptly is pretty narrowly defined under this rule. So that is an area where I think there could be a bit of confusion within the agency, and we're going to want to see how that's going to be individually enforced. And the other area is that now we have to provide the date of corrective action, and we need to provide this on the workplace exam where the adverse condition is listed. Now it brings up the question of, do we have to say there is a condition that exists over the course of several shifts? Do we need to include that description on each shift? And if so, do we need to include a corrective action on this shift, on each shift's record? What MSHA has said is that you do not need to include that on each subsequent record. It is not required. But it may be a best practice just so an inspector isn't confused about why that condition isn't listed. So it might be something that we want to consider, some way of noting without or while identifying that it was previously identified on a prior shift. Also, MSHA has said that you only need to provide the date of corrective action on the first instance in which it's noted, or the first record in which it's noted, that adverse condition. I recommend, as I said before, any document that has a note of a defect or an adverse condition you include the corrective date. Or you include in there C exam dated this time and date. So I think we need to be very clear about where our dates and times are located, especially on this new exam. So, I want to remove, if I'm an operator, confusion by MSHA or any inspector to say that this wasn't listed or this wasn't included. Hopefully this is going to be an area where if we have multiple exams and multiple conditions listed, we are being clear in our note-taking that it was corrected on such a date, or it was referred back to or referring back to the first instance where it was recorded. I see a couple questions rolling in. I'm going to try, for time's sake, to move through the remainder of the presentation and then answer your questions. So I have not forgot about you, and please keep asking them if anything comes up. We've talked a bit about this, but the requirement that mine operators must promptly notify miners of adverse conditions observed unless promptly corrected. Again, there's that promptly corrected. And, we'll break this down a bit more because it's a really important element of this, as much so that MSHA gives us a definition of what they believe prompt means. And they think that that means before miners begin working in the affected area, or as soon as possible after work begins if the condition is discovered while they are working in an area. So we need to identify these adverse conditions, if not corrected before the miners enter an area, either before or as soon as possible. And I think that as soon as possible is especially important when we are exercising the right to do this exam as miners begin work in an area. If we are doing the workplace exam before miners begin work in an area, it can be during shift assignment, it can be during a toolbox talk, and we also have to keep in mind that, just like what we said about contractors there earlier, we must notify any miner who enters an area later of those same conditions. And we aren't required to notify the entire workforce about a condition observed in a corner of one processing plant or one high wall. We just need to look at what individuals are going to be working in that affected area are going to be infected by that. So it's one that we have to keep on top of, this prompt notification. MSHA has said that it can be provided by verbal communication. Again, as we said during those meetings, it can be by signage, or it can be by other written notification. So, this begs the question, and a lot of people are concerned, and what happens if MSHA comes out and sees an adverse condition and asks the miner, hey, did you know about that? And they say, oh, I had no idea. Or, no, I wasn't told about that before I came in. That's one area where signage would be helpful. I see that one of the questions is barrier tape acceptable. MSHA has said that barrier tape may not be acceptable depending on the situation alone, but with other barriers such as cones or signage, it can be effective, or other written notification. I've talked to some companies who want to do a review of the workplace exam prior to shift beginning and have an initial spot at the bottom for everyone that was working in that area that they were provided a notice of any adverse condition by initialing on the bottom of the form. These are areas that we're going to have to work out as a company on how we want to implement the requirement. But I would, whatever we do, I would on that workplace exam or somewhere else record what time we provided that notification and maybe who was present if there's going to be any question. But I would want to know when I provided that so I could tell an inspector if a question ever arose. No, on this date, we discussed any adverse conditions present at this time. Also, if there aren't any adverse conditions present, or anything that was present was abated prior to work beginning in the area or miners entering the area, we don't need to provide any notification. But this is an area I think that, again, is going to be open to a good bit of subjective interpretation on what is considered adequate notice. Adequacy is a question that always likes to rear its head when we're talking about whether or not something was done sufficiently with MSHA. You know, there was just a recent case about whether or not a workplace exam was done adequately. So it is creeping into this rule even prior to the new regulation. To summarize on the record keeping, we are obviously going to be looking at the same retention period, 12 months. Again, we talked about that a record has to be created before the end of the shift for which that exam was conducted. And it's going to include more information than we previously had to. So the name of the examiner, the date, locations examined. Again, that's where I think if we were going to have multiple persons performing those workplace exams, that's where we're going to have to be specific about what areas were looked at by whom. Descriptions of any and all adverse conditions found, again, that comes with the asterisk, which were not promptly abated, and the data to corrective action. As we talked about before, this still has to be made available to MSHA, as well as any miner representatives. Now, one question that has come up is, can we do this electronically? The answer is yes, you can maintain electronic records. MSHA wants those to be on a secure system, meaning they cannot be manipulated or cannot be affected after their creation or something around that, some secure system. Also, they want them to be able to be printed at the request of the inspector. So make sure it's a system that if you're going to be doing electronic, it is something that can be easily printed out and provided to the inspector when it's requested. So those are some of the issues that are going to be changing with the record keeping. It's going to be more information. We have to create it by the end of each shift, and we really are going to have to, keep these in an orderly fashion in the event that we have to do a corrective date at a later date and time. So with that, I would recommend that when we're looking at this, we look at what is going on with our policies and our exams. We want to be clear on this with our workforce. We want to be clear on it internally about what has to be done when and by who. We don't want to have any questions about people going into an area that wasn't examined because there was confusion about who was doing it that day. And again, with anything, we're going to establish a system and going to be able to implement that at an easier time. We want to really encourage people to report conditions throughout the entire work shift. And if conditions are identified, we want to follow similar requirements in terms of promptly initiating abatement and promptly protecting workers from that or notifying. But there is a question about whether or not we need to manipulate our record. Now, MSHA has said at times one of the reasons they want this to be created by the end of each shift, that they want it to be somewhat of a living document throughout the shift. But there's no requirement of that. So if we reduce everything to writing as we move forward, we might want to keep a separate record of things that come up, and if they're not corrected by the end of the shift, we want to make sure that they're included on the next workplace exam. That's also another reason why I think it's important that we timestamp when the workplace exams are completed so that we can be sure that they were completed at 8 a.m. or 6 a.m. or 10 p.m., depending on the shift. And if a condition is found later in that shift, there is a basis or a reason why it was not on that exam. We want to, have the same workplace exam template, I would imagine, for all operations. I think that's going to be an important element, and all persons using the same one, since we are likely going to have multiple people completing the exam. I would recommend that you ensure that your independent contractors are complying with the new requirements as well. If we have a situation where a contractor is the only person or only company working in an area, You know, I'm not saying that the operator needs to or should be doing a workplace exam prior to that unless your own people are going in there. But remember, this is under strict liability under the Mine Act. If a independent contractor is not doing a workplace exam or isn't doing it incorrectly, ultimately the liability could filter back to the production operator. So make sure that your contractors who might not be following this as closely are aware of the new requirements and are complying with them. Again, I think the during shift, if we are time stamping our workplace exams when they are completed, I think we would want to keep some kind of record of anything discovered during that shift so that it can be referenced when we're, if not corrected, performing the next shift workplace exam. It can be included. Again, track the time and means of notification to miners, and that might include signage, but that would also, I imagine, include having a wide range of signage on hand to put up. So, it's largely probably going to be verbal communication, and I would recommend that we keep some record about when that one occurred. And I would also, again, recommend that you have a record or a list of the inactive areas on each day, or if you have an area that is not going to be active, maybe it's abandoned completely, or maybe it's going to be abandoned for the next 3 or 6 months, I would make note of that so that there is no question if MSHA comes on site why an area was not inspected. And also, if for any reason some miners have to go into that area at that point in time or any point in time during a shift, remember that a workplace exam has to be completed in accordance with this regulation. So, again, I appreciate everyone coming out. If there's any additional questions, please let me know. Not sure why the photo is incorrect on this, but please, we'll keep updates going on our blog, the MSHA Defense Report. We'll also have 3 more webinars throughout the year, and again, I do apologize for the photographs on this having uploaded incorrectly, but we'll do several more webinars. On questions, there is one remaining question that we didn't get to, and if I did not answer any of the previous questions adequately enough, please chime in, or if there are any additional ones. But the question was, as a contractor visiting the site, are we responsible for our own work area examination? As we talked about earlier, MSHA has said that a production operator can complete the workplace exam for an area, and the contractor can rely on that. The production operator will be responsible for notifying of any adverse conditions. I think, as a production operator, I would want to require independent contractors complete their own workplace exam on a site that I may attain. And I also would recommend, as an independent contractor, that I complete my own workplace exam so I'm not working or relying on a document that I do not have control over. Also, I'm then relying on the training of another company. And just in my interpretation, I would want to have my own record of that. So if there's any other questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. My contact information is correct, while the photo is not. I apologize again on that. The recording from this webinar, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint, will be made available to you all within the next couple of days by email. And if there's any additional questions or follow-up, please don't hesitate to contact me by any of the means on the screen. So if there's any additional questions, I'm happy to take those now, or thank you for your time, and I appreciate everyone logging on today.